A man looked at a girl's bedroom window every night. When the apartment owner found out why, she was in shock. The night was quiet, but not silent. In the distance, the hum of the city never truly faded, a constant reminder that life never stops, even after darkness settles. Streetlights flickered with a dim orange glow, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. The air carried the scent of rain that had fallen earlier, mixing with the faint aroma of gasoline and distant food stalls closing for the night. And then there was him. Every night, without fail, the man stood on the sidewalk, just across from the apartment building. His posture was always the same, rigid, yet not aggressive. His hands rested deep inside the pockets of his worn-out coat, his face partially hidden by the shadow of his hood. But his eyes, dark and steady, were fixed on a single window, the window of a child's bedroom. Inside, the soft yellow light illuminated the room's pastel-colored walls. Sometimes, the little girl could be seen playing with stuffed animals, her laughter muffled by the glass. Other times, she sat on the bed, listening as her mother read a bedtime story. And on rare occasions, she simply stood by the window, staring out at the world beyond, unaware of the man who never looked away. No one ever questioned him. The people who lived nearby noticed, of course. The old woman who walked her dog late at night had glanced at him more than once, but never spoke a word. The tired office worker returning from a long shift saw him nearly every evening, yet dismissed him as just another lonely soul swallowed by the city. Even the security guard at the building's entrance had grown accustomed to his presence. In a city as big as this, mysteries existed everywhere, and often people chose to ignore them. But one person had begun to notice more than just the strangeness of it all. Sarah, the mother of the little girl, had seen the man too. At first, she thought it was coincidence. A stranger waiting for a ride, someone lost, or simply a harmless wanderer. But as the weeks passed, a sinking feeling began to grow in her chest. He was always there, always watching. And the worst part was, she didn't know why. That night, as Sarah tucked Emily into bed, she hesitated by the window. The curtains were open, revealing the world outside. The street, quiet as always. The parked cars, the dim glow of the streetlights. And, of course, the man. Her breath caught in her throat. She reached for the curtain, heart pounding, and slowly began to close it. Just before the fabric covered the glass, she dared to take one last glance. That was when it happened. For the first time since she had noticed him, he moved. A slow step forward. Just one. Sarah's stomach twisted. And then, just as suddenly as he had moved, he stepped back again, returning to his place, his eyes never leaving the window. Sarah yanked the curtain shut. Her hands trembled as she locked the window, as if that thin pane of glass had been her last defense. She didn't sleep that night. And by morning, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't ignore him any more. Sarah had never been the paranoid type. She wasn't the kind of mother who obsessed over every possible danger lurking around her daughter. She kept her doors locked, of course, and taught Emily never to talk to strangers. But she had always believed that most fears were exaggerated. Not this time. She had seen the man too many times now. It wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a mistake. And it certainly wasn't normal. The morning after another sleepless night, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at her untouched cup of coffee. The rich aroma should have been comforting, but all she could think about was the figure standing across the street. His presence had burrowed into her mind like a splinter she couldn't remove. Emily sat at the small dining table, swinging her legs under the chair, completely unaware of her mother's turmoil. She hummed softly as she munched on a slice of toast, crumbs scattering on the plate. "Mom?" Sarah jolted, blinking herself back to reality. Emily's bright blue eyes, so full of innocence, gazed up at her with curiosity. "Yes, sweetheart. You look tired." Sarah forced a smile, reaching over to tuck a stray lock of golden hair behind her daughter's ear. "I just didn't sleep well, that's all," she said, hoping her voice sounded normal. Emily scrunched her nose. "Were you having bad dreams?" Sarah hesitated. No, the problem wasn't in her dreams. It was right outside her window. She exhaled slowly and gave Emily a reassuring squeeze on the shoulder. "No, honey. Just thinking too much." Emily seemed satisfied with the answer and returned to her breakfast, but Sarah's own appetite was gone. Her mind was already turning, mapping out what she needed to do. First, she needed to know how long this had been going on. That afternoon, after dropping Emily off at school, Sarah took the long way home, walking past the small bakery near the corner. The woman who owned it, Mrs. Adler, had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. If anyone paid attention to unusual things around here, it would be her. The bell jingled softly as Sarah stepped inside. The warm scent of fresh bread wrapped around her like a comforting embrace, but she didn't have time to enjoy it. Mrs. Adler, a stocky woman in her 60s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes, looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Sarah, haven't seen you in a few days. What can I get for you, dear?" Sarah hesitated. She hadn't planned on being subtle, but now that she was here, the words felt strangely difficult to form. "Actually," she said, stepping closer, lowering her voice, "I wanted to ask you something." Mrs. Adler tilted her head, curious. "Have you ever noticed a man standing across from my apartment at night?" Sarah asked. "Tall, thin, always wearing a coat with the hood up?" Mrs. Adler's face shifted ever so slightly, her smile faltering just enough to make Sarah's pulse quicken. "Oh," the older woman said, wiping her hands on her apron. "You mean him." Sarah's stomach tightened. Him. The fact that Mrs. Adler didn't even need a description sent a fresh wave of unease through her. "So, you have seen him?" Mrs. Adler nodded. "He's been around for months now. I see him sometimes when I close up late at night. Doesn't do much. Just stands there." She narrowed her eyes slightly. "Why do you ask? He's not bothering you, is he?" Sarah's fingers tightened around the strap of her purse. "He watches Emily's window." Mrs. Adler's expression darkened. "Are you sure?" Sarah nodded, swallowing against the dry lump in her throat. Mrs. Adler was silent for a moment, then sighed, shaking her head. "I knew something felt off about that man. Thought about calling the police once, but he never does anything. Just stands there, quiet as a ghost." Sarah understood the hesitation. The man wasn't technically breaking any laws. He wasn't trespassing. He wasn't making threats. He was just watching. And yet, there was something deeply wrong about it. "Do you know where he goes during the day?" she asked. Mrs. Adler frowned, thinking. "Hard to say. I've only ever seen him at night." Sarah nodded slowly. That meant if she wanted real answers, she would have to take matters into her own hands. That evening, Sarah put Emily to bed earlier than usual. She kissed her forehead, tucked the blankets tightly around her, and made sure her favorite stuffed rabbit was within reach. "Mom," Emily murmured sleepily. "Yes, sweetheart." The little girl rubbed her eyes. "Why do you always close the curtains now?" Sarah hesitated, then smoothed Emily's hair gently. "So you can sleep better, honey. No streetlights bothering you." Emily seemed satisfied with the answer, her eyes already fluttering closed. Within minutes, her breathing slowed, slipping into the deep rhythm of sleep. Sarah stood up and quietly left the room, pulling the door shut behind her. Then, she went to her own window. She didn't turn off the lights. She wanted to see if he would come. Minutes passed. Then half an hour. And then there he was. Sarah's breath hitched as she spotted the familiar silhouette across the street. He was standing in the same place as always, his face obscured by the shadows, his gaze directed at Emily's window. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. Tonight, she wasn't just going to watch from behind a curtain. Tonight, she was going to do something about it. Sarah's pulse pounded against her ribs as she stood by the window, her breath shallow, her fingers curled into tight fists. The man was there, just as he always was. His tall, lean frame was partially obscured by the dim glow of the streetlights, but she could see the faint rise and fall of his chest. He was real. He was watching. And tonight, she wasn't going to just stand by. Moving carefully so as not to wake Emily, she slipped into her coat, grabbed her phone, and took a deep breath before stepping out into the hallway. The apartment door closed behind her with a soft click, but the sound felt deafening in the quiet of the night. The elevator was too slow. She took the stairs, each step echoing in the empty stairwell. By the time she reached the ground floor, her adrenaline had turned to something sharper, something that felt an awful lot like rage. The man was still there, unmoving. Sarah pushed through the heavy glass door of the building and stepped onto the sidewalk. The cold air bit at her skin, but she barely felt it. With each step, her heart pounded harder. Her boots hit the pavement with a determined rhythm. The man didn't move. Not when she crossed the street. Not when she closed the distance between them. Not even when she stopped just a few feet away. It was as if he had been expecting her. Up close, she could see him better. He was older than she had imagined, perhaps in his 60s. The deep lines on his face were barely visible beneath the hood of his worn-out coat, but they were there, carved into his skin like the marks of a life filled with regret. His hands, tucked deep into his pockets, didn't fidget. He didn't seem nervous. He simply stood there, watching her approach with the same unwavering gaze he had fixed on the window night after night. Sarah's throat was dry, but she forced herself to speak. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "Why do you keep coming here?" The man blinked slowly, as if waking from a trance. His lips parted, but no sound came out at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, like someone who hadn't used it in a long time. "She reminds me of someone." Sarah's spine stiffened. Her fingers clenched around her phone, her thumb hovering near the screen, ready to call the police if she had to. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight. The man lowered his gaze for the first time, staring at the cracked pavement beneath their feet. He took a deep breath, and when he looked back up, there was something raw in his expression. Something almost haunted. "She reminds me of my daughter," he said. "The one I lost." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. A dozen thoughts collided in her mind at once. Lies. Manipulation. A trick to lower her guard. And yet, there was something painfully real in the way he said it. The kind of pain that couldn't be faked. Still, she wasn't ready to believe him. "You've been standing here for weeks," she said, her voice unsteady. "Just staring at her room. That's not normal." The man nodded slowly, as if he understood how strange it must have seemed. "I know," he murmured. "I never meant to scare you." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Then why didn't you stop?" The man hesitated. His shoulders, already weighed down by his heavy coat, seemed to sink even further. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I couldn't." Sarah's stomach twisted. She wanted to walk away, to grab Emily and leave this place behind. But instead, she found herself asking the question she wasn't sure she wanted the answer to. "What happened to your daughter?" The man exhaled shakily, his breath curling into the cold night air. For a long moment he didn't speak. Sarah thought he might not answer at all. Then, finally, "I lost her." His voice cracked on the last word. Not in the way people do when they're lying. but in the way people do when they're remembering something they would give anything to forget. Sarah felt an unexpected chill creep up her spine, different from the cold air pressing against her skin. For the first time since she had seen him, the man didn't seem threatening. He seemed broken. She didn't know what to say. So she just stood there, staring at him, waiting for him to continue. And he did. "Her name was Lily," he murmured. "She would have been the same age as your daughter now." Sarah's heart clenched. Would have been. The words echoed in her mind. Something inside her shifted. Still, she wasn't ready to trust him. Not yet. But she also wasn't ready to walk away. Not until she knew the full story. Sarah stood there, her breath visible in the cold night air, her mind racing with questions. The man, Thomas, had finally given her a name. Lily. A daughter who was supposed to be Emily's age. But she wasn't. Something had happened. Something that had left this man standing outside her window night after night, staring into a past he could never reach again. And yet, Sarah wasn't ready to let her guard down. "You lost her?" she repeated, her voice carefully measured. "What do you mean?" Thomas exhaled heavily, rubbing his hands together as if trying to warm them, though Sarah had a feeling that whatever coldness lived inside him had nothing to do with the weather. "I was young," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "And stupid." Sarah didn't speak, didn't interrupt. She let the silence stretch, waiting for him to continue. Thomas's gaze drifted to the ground, his shoulders weighed down by something heavier than time. "I met my wife, Claire, when we were both barely out of school," he said. "We got married too fast. Had Lily even faster." A faint, bitter smile flickered across his lips. "She was the best thing I ever had, and I let it all slip through my fingers." Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. What happened? Thomas swallowed hard. "I made bad choices," he admitted. "The kind that push people away. I worked too much, drank too much, came home too late, missed too much. Claire did everything for Lily. She never said it outright, but I could see it in her eyes, that exhaustion, that disappointment." His voice cracked slightly, but he pushed forward. "One day I came home and they were gone." Sarah blinked. "Gone?" Thomas nodded. "Claire packed up everything and left. Took Lily with her. No note, no warning. Just a gone." He let out a bitter chuckle. "And I deserved it." Sarah wasn't sure how to respond. For a moment, she tried to imagine that kind of loss. To wake up one day and find her daughter missing, as if she had never been there at all. The thought made her stomach churn. Still, part of her was skeptical. "So you just never found them?" she asked cautiously. Thomas sighed. "I tried. At first. I searched, I called people we knew, even hired someone to track them down. But it was like Claire had erased herself from existence." His fingers curled into fists inside his coat pockets. "And after a while, I stopped trying. What right did I have, anyway? I had already failed them." Sarah could hear the weight in his voice, the years of regret wrapped around every word. But something still wasn't adding up. "That still doesn't explain why you're here," she said carefully. "Why you're watching my daughter." Thomas hesitated. Then, very slowly, he lifted his gaze and looked at her, really looked at her. "The first time I saw her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "it felt like I was seeing a ghost." A chill ran down Sarah's spine. "She looks like Lily," Thomas continued. "The same big eyes, the same way she tilts her head when she's thinking. Even the way she laughs." He let out a shuddering breath. "I know how it sounds. I know it's crazy. But for a moment, just a moment, it was like she was still here." Sarah's throat tightened. Because as much as she wanted to reject it, to fight it, she understood. The idea of losing Emily was something she could barely think about without breaking into a cold sweat. And this man, he had lived it. Every single day. She took a step back, exhaling shakily. "This isn't right," she said, her voice barely steady. "You can't keep doing this. You can't just stand outside and watch her like this. It's not fair, to her, to me, or to you." Thomas nodded slowly, as if he had already expected that answer. "I know," he said. "I know it's wrong. I just didn't know how to stop." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The cold wind whispered between them, carrying the distant sounds of the city, a car passing, a dog barking, a faint murmur of laughter from somewhere far away. And then Sarah did something she hadn't planned to do. She asked the question she never thought she would ask. "What if we talked?" Thomas looked up, confused. "What?" Sarah's jaw tightened, but she didn't back down. "What if, instead of standing out here in the dark like a ghost, you talked to me?" She crossed her arms, trying to ignore how insane this sounded. "Not to Emily. Not to anyone else. Just me." Thomas studied her, his face unreadable. "I don't want you near my daughter," Sarah continued, her voice firm. "But I do want to understand. If there's truth in what you're saying, I want to hear it. I want to know about Lily." A flicker of something, shock, relief, crossed Thomas's features. He hesitated. Then, finally, he gave a slow nod. "Okay," he said. Sarah exhaled, barely realizing she had been holding her breath. She didn't know if she had just made a mistake. But something told her. This story was far from over. Sarah didn't sleep that night. After her confrontation with Thomas, she had locked the door behind her, bolted the windows, and checked on Emily twice before forcing herself to lie down. But sleep never came. Her mind wouldn't stop replaying their conversation. The way his voice had cracked when he spoke about losing Lily. The way his eyes, deep and hollow, like someone carrying a lifetime of grief, had softened when he spoke about Emily. The way he had agreed, almost too easily, to talk to her instead of standing outside in the dark. What am I doing? It was a mistake. It had to be. She should have called the police. She should have forced him to stay away. And yet, some part of her, some strange, unshakable part, believed him. Not entirely. Not yet. But enough to want to know more. The next morning, Sarah dropped Emily off at school as usual. She kissed her daughter's forehead and watched as she ran toward the entrance, her blonde ponytail bouncing with every step. Emily turned back and waved. Sarah waved back, forcing a smile, but her chest felt tight. She didn't know what she was doing anymore. As she drove back home, her mind raced. She had spent the night searching online for anything about a missing child named Lily. She had typed in every variation she could think of, missing reports, obituaries, old news articles. Nothing. There was no trace of Thomas's past. No proof that he was telling the truth. No proof that he wasn't. That was almost worse. She parked in front of her building, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. She needed to be smart about this. She needed to be careful. That evening, just after putting Emily to bed, Sarah stood by her window, peeking through the curtains. He was there. Not across the street this time, but on the corner, under the streetlight, waiting. A part of her wanted to pretend she didn't see him, to lock the doors and pretend this wasn't happening. But she had made a choice. Wrapping her coat tightly around her, she stepped out of the apartment. She crossed the street, her heart hammering with each step. Thomas turned when he saw her approaching. His face was unreadable, but he didn't look surprised. It was as if he had known she would come. "Hey," he said, his voice rough. Sarah swallowed, stopping a few feet away from him. "Let's talk." Thomas nodded. Okay. Sarah hesitated, then glanced at the small coffee shop down the street. Inside, she said, where it's warm. For a moment, Thomas looked like he might refuse. Then, with a slow nod, he followed her. The coffee shop was nearly empty at this hour. The warm glow of the lights cast soft shadows on the wooden walls. The faint hum of jazz music played from the speakers, mixing with the quiet murmur of the barista wiping down the counter. Sarah and Thomas sat at a small table near the back. She ordered a coffee. He didn't order anything. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah folded her arms and leaned forward. I looked for her, she said. Thomas frowned. What? Lily, Sarah said, watching his face carefully. I searched online. There's no missing person report. No news articles. No records. Thomas exhaled slowly, rubbing his hands together. I told you, Claire took her. She didn't go missing. She just left. Sarah's stomach twisted. That part still didn't sit right with her. How do you know she's not out there somewhere? She asked. That she's not still. She's gone, Thomas interrupted. Sarah flinched. For the first time, real emotion cracked through his voice. She got sick, he said, his voice raw. Not long after they left. Claire never told me. I didn't find out until years later. Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. What happened? Thomas swallowed, his hands tightening into fists. She had leukemia, he murmured. By the time I found out, it was too late. Sarah's breath hitched. She died. Thomas nodded, his gaze distant. She was 6. Sarah's stomach twisted violently. 6. The same age as Emily. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. The idea of losing her daughter, of waking up one day and realizing she was gone, just gone, was unbearable. No wonder Thomas was stuck in the past. No wonder he stood outside her window, staring at Emily like she was something fragile, something he might lose all over again. Why didn't Claire tell you? Sarah asked, her voice softer now. Thomas let out a bitter laugh. Would you have told me? After everything I put them through. He shook his head. I wasn't there when Lily needed me. I wasn't there at all. Sarah didn't know what to say. She had spent days fearing this man, wondering if he was dangerous. But looking at him now, sitting in this dimly lit coffee shop, shoulders hunched, eyes hollow, she realized he was dangerous. But not in the way she had feared. He was dangerous because he had nothing left. Because ghosts don't stop haunting people until they find a way to rest. And Thomas. He had never let Lily go. Sarah exhaled shakily, rubbing her temples. Thomas, she said carefully, you can't keep watching my daughter. He closed his eyes for a moment. I know. Sarah hesitated. Then why do you? Thomas opened his eyes. And when he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Because for a moment, just a moment, it feels like she's still here. The words hit Sarah like a punch to the chest. She knew she should tell him to leave. To stay away. To never come back. But instead, she found herself asking something she never expected. What if, she said, her voice unsteady, there was another way? Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Sarah swallowed. She didn't know what she meant. Not yet. But something inside her told her that this story wasn't over. Not yet. The next morning, Sarah was still replaying the conversation with Thomas in her mind. Every word, every strained breath, every flicker of pain in his eyes, it haunted her. She had been so sure she was dealing with something sinister. But what she found was a man broken by grief, clinging to a past that no longer existed. And now she had done something unthinkable. She had not told him to leave. She had not called the police. Instead, she had left that coffee shop with a strange, unspoken understanding between them. But understanding wasn't trust. And she still had to protect Emily. That afternoon, Sarah waited outside Emily's school. The sun had barely started to set, casting a warm golden glow over the playground. She watched as Emily ran toward her, her backpack bouncing against her small shoulders, her face flushed from playing with her friends. Sarah forced a smile. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Emily grinned. "Mrs. Carter read us a really funny story. It was about a dog that thought he was a cat." She giggled, holding Sarah's hand as they crossed the street. "And then I drew a picture of you and me and Mr. Flopsy." Sarah's chest tightened. Emily was so innocent, so unaware of the strange darkness that had settled over their lives. As they reached their apartment building, Sarah's stomach twisted. Across the street, half hidden in the shadow of a tree, Thomas stood. He wasn't watching the window this time. He was watching them. Sarah's pulse spiked. She squeezed Emily's hand a little tighter, instinctively pulling her closer. And then something unexpected happened. Emily saw him. For weeks, Sarah had done everything to shield her daughter from noticing the man. But now, Emily's bright blue eyes landed on him, and instead of fear, she smiled. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Before she could stop her, Emily lifted a tiny hand and waved. Thomas's entire body tensed. His hands clenched at his sides as if he didn't know what to do. And then, hesitantly, he waved back. A small, uncertain movement. Almost involuntary. Sarah's heart pounded. It was such a simple thing, so innocent, so natural. But in that moment, Sarah saw something shift in Thomas's expression. The unbearable weight he carried, the years of grief carved into his face. Just for a second, it lightened. And that terrified her more than anything. She needed to get Emily inside. "No. Come on, sweetie," she murmured, leading her daughter up the steps. Emily glanced up at her, confused. "Mommy, who was that?" Sarah hesitated, her mind scrambling for an answer. "No one," she said quickly. "Just a man." Emily frowned but didn't press further. Sarah kept her composure until they were safely inside the apartment, the door locked behind them. Only then did she let herself exhale, her body trembling with adrenaline. This can't happen again. Thomas had been nothing but quiet. But the fact that Emily had noticed him, had acknowledged him, it was dangerous. Because now he wasn't just watching. Now he had been seen. That night, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the way Thomas had looked at Emily. Not with malice. Not with obsession. But with pain. Like a starving man who had just been offered food, only to realize it wasn't his to take. But that didn't make it okay. Sarah knew what she had to do. She pulled out her phone, scrolling through her contacts until she found the building's security office. Her finger hovered over the call button. This was it. This was her chance to end this, to report him, to have him removed, to make sure he never came near Emily again. But then she thought of his eyes in that moment. The brief, flickering sadness. The kind that only belonged to people who had already lost everything. Sarah clenched her jaw, her finger trembling above the screen. And then, with a sharp exhale, she put the phone down. She didn't know why. Maybe she did believe him. Maybe she just wasn't ready to let the story end here. Either way, she had made her choice. And something told her it would change everything. Sarah barely slept that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind tangled in thoughts she didn't want to have. The logical part of her screamed that she had made a mistake by not reporting Thomas, that she was risking too much by allowing him to stay close. But then there was the other part, the one that remembered the raw grief in his voice, the brokenness in his eyes, the way he had hesitated before waving back at Emily as if he was afraid he had no right to. She had spent so many nights fearing what he was, but now she feared something else entirely. What if he was telling the truth? What if there really had been a Lily? What if he really had lost her, just as he said? And most unsettling of all, what if Emily reminded him of her for a reason? Sarah turned on her side, trying to push away the uneasy thoughts, but sleep never came. The next day, she made a decision. If she was going to figure out the truth, she needed more than just his word. She needed proof. After dropping Emily off at school, Sarah sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open, her fingers poised over the keyboard. She typed, "Lily missing, New York, Father Thomas nothing." She tried again, changing the keywords, Lily, Thomas, leukemia, obituary still nothing. She bit her lip, frustration tightening in her chest. If Thomas was telling the truth, why wasn't there anything about his daughter online? It didn't make sense. Maybe she needed to search differently. Maybe she needed to stop looking for Lily's death and start looking for Thomas's past. After a few more minutes of searching, she found something. A news article, one that was more than 20 years old. The headline read, "Local man arrested for drunken altercation, wife and child missing." Sarah's stomach dropped. She clicked the link, scanning the faded text. The article was short, just a few paragraphs long. It mentioned a Thomas Whitaker, arrested after causing a scene at a bar one evening. Witnesses claimed he had been intoxicated and shouting about his family leaving him. At the time of his arrest, his wife and young daughter had already been missing for weeks. The police had investigated, but there were no signs of foul play, just a woman who had wanted to disappear. Sarah's pulse quickened. This was him. This was his story. And if the article was accurate, Claire had taken their daughter and vanished. But was it true that Lily had died? Or was that just what Thomas believed? Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind spinning. If Lily had died, there should be a death certificate, a hospital record, something. But if there was nothing? Sarah's heart pounded as a terrifying thought took root. What if Lily was still alive? That evening, Sarah couldn't stop staring at Thomas's usual spot across the street. He wasn't there. For the first time in weeks, the sidewalk was empty. Sarah's stomach twisted. Had he finally given up? Had he decided to walk away? And if he had, why did that thought bother her? Just as she was about to turn away, she saw movement out of the corner of her eye. Not from across the street, but from down the sidewalk. Sarah froze as Thomas stepped out from the shadows of a narrow alleyway. He didn't take his usual place under the streetlight. Instead, he walked slowly toward the building. Toward her. Sarah's breath hitched. He had never done this before. Her fingers curled around the doorknob instinctively, her pulse hammering. And then, to her complete shock, he didn't stop at the entrance. He raised a hand, hesitant, unsure, and knocked. Sarah's throat went dry. Her instincts screamed at her not to answer. But her curiosity had already won. Slowly, cautiously, she opened the door. Thomas stood there, looking more uncertain than she had ever seen him. His hands were in the pockets of his coat, his shoulders slightly hunched. Up close, she could see how tired he looked, how deeply exhausted he truly was. "I need to ask you something," he said quietly. Sarah swallowed hard, gripping the doorframe. "What?" Thomas hesitated, glancing past her toward the hallway, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then he looked back at her, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did she see me?" Sarah's chest tightened. She knew exactly what he meant. "Emily." "Yes," Sarah admitted, her voice steadier than she felt. "She saw you." Thomas exhaled slowly, as if hearing those words confirmed something for him. Sarah watched his reaction carefully. "What does that mean to you?" she asked, her voice sharper than before. Thomas looked down, his fingers curling into fists. "I don't know," he muttered. I never thought she would." Sarah's stomach twisted. "And what if she did?" she pressed. Thomas finally looked at her again, his dark eyes filled with something unreadable. "I don't know," he repeated, but this time there was something fragile in his voice. Something that sounded dangerously close to hope. Sarah swallowed, her thoughts racing. This was more than grief. More than regret. This was something else. And Sarah wasn't sure she wanted to know what it was. But she also wasn't sure she could walk away. Not anymore. Sarah had never been a woman who let fear dictate her choices. She had moved to this city alone, started a new life with Emily after her divorce, and built a home for them with nothing but sheer determination. But standing there, in the dim glow of the hallway, staring at the man who had haunted her nights for weeks, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Doubt. Thomas stood at her doorstep, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat, his expression unreadable. He had asked a simple question, "Did she see me?" But there was nothing simple about what it meant. And the way he had reacted, the way his voice had changed, Sarah didn't know if it scared her more than his silence ever had. She tightened her grip on the doorframe, grounding herself. "Why does it matter?" Thomas hesitated, his jaw tightening as if he was holding something back. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled. "I told you," he said quietly. "Emily reminds me of Lily." Sarah crossed her arms. "You've already said that." Thomas nodded slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know. But it's more than that." Something about the way he said it made Sarah's breath catch. "What do you mean?" she pressed, her pulse quickening. He finally looked up, meeting her gaze, and what she saw there sent a chill down her spine. "I mean, she doesn't just look like Lily," he murmured. "She feels like her." Sarah's stomach twisted. "That doesn't make any sense." Thomas swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I know," he admitted. "But when she saw me, when she waved, for a moment I thought, I felt—" He trailed off, shaking his head. Sarah stared at him, trying to decipher the storm behind his eyes. "You felt what?" she asked, her voice softer now. Thomas hesitated. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I felt like she knew me." Sarah's breath hitched. "No," she said immediately, shaking her head. "That's impossible." Thomas let out a shaky breath, running a hand over his face. "I know how it sounds." "No," Sarah repeated, her heartbeat hammering in her chest. "You're grieving. You're confused. You want to see something that isn't there." Thomas looked at her, something desperate in his expression. "Maybe," he admitted. Or maybe he didn't finish the sentence. And Sarah wasn't sure she wanted him to. For the next few days, Sarah tried to push the conversation out of her mind. She focused on work. She helped Emily with her homework. She cooked, cleaned, did everything she could to maintain the structure of their normal life. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Because Thomas had stopped watching. After weeks of standing outside their apartment every night, he had disappeared. And for some reason, that scared her more than when he had been there. Because now, she wasn't just questioning him. She was questioning herself. Had there really been something in Emily's reaction? Had there been something in the way she had waved, in the way Thomas had looked at her? Was it really just coincidence? Or was it something else entirely? Then, on Friday afternoon, something happened that made Sarah's blood turn cold. She had picked Emily up from school and stopped by the grocery store. It had been an ordinary day, filled with ordinary things. But as they walked home, Emily suddenly spoke. "Mommy," she said, her small voice thoughtful. "That man. I think I've seen him before." Sarah's heart stopped. She tightened her grip on Emily's hand, her pulse roaring in her ears. "What man, sweetheart?" Emily looked up at her, blinking. "The one from the other day. The one I waved to." Sarah swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "You mean the man across the street?" Emily nodded. "Yeah. I think I saw him before." Sarah's chest tightened. "Where?" Emily frowned, her little nose scrunching as she tried to remember. "I don't know," she said slowly. "But he feels familiar." Sarah's blood ran ice-cold. Familiar. The same word Thomas had used. Her grip on the grocery bag tightened. This was just a coincidence. It had to be. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her voice carefully neutral. Emily nodded. "Yeah. But I don't know why." Sarah forced a smile. "Maybe you saw him in the neighborhood before." "Maybe," Emily murmured, but she didn't sound convinced. Neither was Sarah. As they walked up the steps to their apartment, her hands trembled. She had to talk to Thomas. She had to know the truth. Because suddenly, for the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't sure she wanted him to leave. Sarah could no longer ignore it. The logical part of her, the one that had told her from the start that Thomas was nothing more than a lost man, a grieving father clinging to a resemblance that wasn't real, was beginning to crumble. Emily had no reason to recognize Thomas. No reason to feel anything but curiosity toward him. And yet, when she had said that word, familiar, Sarah had felt the ground shift beneath her. It was just a word, but it felt like something more. And she wasn't sure she wanted to know why. That night, after Emily had fallen asleep, Sarah sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. She had texted Thomas an hour ago. "We need to talk." He hadn't responded. Sarah tapped her fingers against the wooden surface, her stomach tight with unease. Maybe she shouldn't have reached out. Maybe she was inviting danger into her life instead of pushing it away. But she needed to know. Just as she was about to give up and go to bed, a soft knock sounded at the door. Sarah's breath caught. She stood slowly, her pulse hammering in her throat as she walked toward the entrance. With a shaky hand, she unlocked the door and pulled it open. Thomas stood there, his face partially shadowed by the dim hallway light. He looked different. Less like the man who had once haunted the sidewalk outside her home. More like a man on the edge of something that terrified him. "You said you wanted to talk," he said quietly. Sarah hesitated, then stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. Thomas seemed reluctant, his eyes flickering toward the living room, as if stepping inside felt like crossing a line he wasn't sure he was allowed to cross. But after a moment, he nodded and walked in. Sarah closed the door behind them. She turned, watching as he stood awkwardly near the window, hands in his coat pockets. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah took a deep breath. "Emily said she's seen you before," she said, her voice careful, measured. Thomas flinched. Sarah didn't miss it. His jaw clenched, his hands tightening into fists inside his coat. "She what?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah folded her arms across her chest, ignoring the nervous tremble in her stomach. "She said she thinks she's seen you before. That you feel familiar to her." Thomas exhaled sharply, turning away for a moment. He ran a hand through his graying hair, his fingers shaking slightly. "She doesn't know me," he muttered, as if trying to convince himself. Sarah's heart pounded. "Then why does she feel like she does?" Thomas didn't answer. Sarah took a step closer. "You said Emily reminds you of Lily," she pressed. "You said it wasn't just how she looked. That it was something else." Thomas nodded slowly, but he didn't turn around. Sarah swallowed, forcing herself to ask the question that had been clawing at the back of her mind. "Is it possible," she whispered, "that it's not just you who remembers?" Thomas froze. Sarah could see the way his shoulders tensed, the way his breath hitched in his chest. Slowly, he turned to face her. His eyes were darker than she had ever seen them. Haunted, desperate, terrified. "You don't know what you're saying," he rasped. Sarah's throat tightened. "Don't I?" Thomas shook his head, his hands gripping the edge of the windowsill like he needed something solid to hold on to. "I've spent years trying to forget," he said, his voice strained. "Trying to let go. And then I saw her, your daughter, and it was like looking at my little girl all over again." His breath came out ragged. "But I knew it wasn't possible. Lily is gone." Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears. "But what if she isn't?" she whispered. Thomas sucked in a sharp breath. "Don't." Sarah took another step forward. "What if—" "No," Thomas cut her off, his voice raw. "Don't say it. Don't think it." Sarah's mind was racing too fast to stop. "She was 6, she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Emily is 6. You lost her when she was a child. And now—" "No," Thomas said again, but there was no force behind the word. Just fear. Sarah's throat was dry, her hands shaking. "Tell me something," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you believe in things we can't explain?" Thomas didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "I never did," he admitted. "Not until now." Sarah's stomach twisted. Because neither did she. But something deep inside her was telling her that this wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. The next morning, Sarah woke up feeling drained, her mind still reeling from the conversation with Thomas. She had barely slept, lying awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of something that should not make sense. But nothing had changed. The feeling, the certainty, was still there. She had to know more. And there was only one person who could give her answers. Her name was Claire Whittaker, Lily's mother. If Lily had truly passed away, Claire would know. And if she hadn't, Sarah didn't know what that meant. She only knew one thing. She was about to find out. Sarah had always believed that some questions should never be asked, because once they could never be taken back. They would hang in the air, refusing to be ignored, demanding answers, no matter how impossible or terrifying they might be. But she had asked anyway. And now she couldn't turn back. The morning air was crisp, the city still waking up as Sarah sat in her parked car, staring at the name on her phone screen. Claire Whittaker. She had found her. After searching through public records, social media, and old online listings, she had come across an address, an old house in a quiet town, just a few hours away. Thomas hadn't wanted to come. She had asked, but he had shaken his head, eyes dark with something unreadable. "I can't," he had whispered. "Not after all these years." So Sarah had come alone. She gripped the steering wheel, her stomach twisting with nerves. What am I even expecting to find? A grieving mother who would confirm Thomas's story? A woman who had moved on, who had built a new life without looking back? Or something else? Something Sarah wasn't sure she was ready for? Taking a deep breath, she opened the car door and stepped out. The house in front of her was small, well-kept but aged, with a wooden porch and pale blue shutters. A wind chime swayed gently in the breeze, the soft tinkling sound oddly soothing. She walked up the steps and knocked. Seconds stretched into eternity before the door finally opened. A woman stood there. Her hair, once dark, was now streaked with gray, tied back in a loose bun. Her face was lined with age and loss, her blue eyes weary but sharp as they took in Sarah, a stranger on her doorstep. "Yes?" she asked cautiously. Sarah swallowed hard. "Claire Whittaker?" The woman hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Sarah's heart pounded. "My name is Sarah Carter," she said. I need to ask you something about your daughter. Claire's face didn't change. She simply stared, her grip tightening on the edge of the door. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asked, "Which one?" Sarah blinked. I mean Lily." For the first time, Claire's expression flickered. Pain. It was gone in an instant, but Sarah saw it, felt it. "Lily's gone," Claire said, her voice clipped, controlled. "She's been gone for a long time." Sarah took a shaky breath. "I know that's what you told Thomas. But is it true?" Claire's body went rigid. "I don't know who you are," she said sharply, "or what you think you're doing, but this is not a conversation I'm willing to have." She started to close the door. Sarah panicked. "She would have been 6, right?" she blurted out. "The same age as my daughter?" Claire froze. Sarah's pulse pounded. "I have a daughter," she continued, her voice trembling. "Her name is Emily. She's 6 years old. And a man who lost his own child, says she reminds him of Lily. Not just in the way she looks, but in the way she is. And the thing is," she swallowed hard, "my daughter recognizes him." Claire didn't move, didn't blink. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, very quietly, Claire exhaled, and whispered, "Oh, God!" Sarah's breath hitched. The woman stepped back, opening the door wider, her face pale. "Come in," she said. The living room was warm, filled with the scent of old books and lavender. Framed photographs lined the shelves, most of them old, their colors slightly faded with time. Claire sat on the couch, hands clasped tightly together, staring at the floor. "I never told Thomas the truth," she said at last. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. "What do you mean?" Claire let out a slow, shaky breath. "I let him believe Lily was dead." Sarah's entire body went cold. "You let him believe?" Claire nodded, her fingers trembling as they twisted together. "I had no choice," she murmured. "I had to protect her." Sarah's throat was dry. "From what?" Claire finally looked up. "From him," she said. Sarah's stomach twisted. "You mean Thomas?" Claire shook her head. "No," she whispered. "From something much worse." Sarah listened in stunned silence as Claire told her the truth. The real truth. Lily had been sick, just as Thomas had said. The doctors had given them no hope. Claire had spent nights by her daughter's bedside, praying for a miracle that never came. And then, one night, something changed. Lily woke up different. She spoke differently. She moved differently. She started saying things she shouldn't have known, calling Claire by a different name, talking about places she had never been, people she had never met. "She told me she wasn't Lily anymore," Claire whispered. "She said she was someone else." Sarah's skin prickled with chills. Claire's voice shook. I wanted to believe it was the fever, the sickness, taking over. But then, I started to believe her." Sarah's breath came faster, her head spinning. "What are you saying?" she whispered. Claire swallowed hard. "I'm saying that my daughter died that year." Her voice broke, but something else woke up inside her. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She gripped the armrest of the couch, her hands trembling, and suddenly everything made sense. Why Thomas had felt drawn to Emily. Why Emily had recognized him. Why neither of them could explain it. Because it wasn't just grief. It wasn't just resemblance. It was memory. And if that was true, then Emily wasn't just Emily. She was something else, too. Someone that had lived before. Sarah stood abruptly, her breath ragged. I have to go," she stammered, backing away. Claire watched her with sad, knowing eyes. "You feel it too, don't you?" she murmured. Sarah's body went rigid. She didn't answer, because she did feel it. She had felt it for weeks. And now she had to face the terrifying possibility that her daughter might not have been hers alone. The drive home was a blur. Sarah barely registered the road, the streetlights flashing past like ghosts in the night. Her hands trembled against the steering wheel, her pulse a steady, frantic drum in her ears. Claire's words wouldn't stop echoing in her mind. I let him believe Lily was dead. But something else woke up inside her. It was impossible. It was insane. And yet, Sarah swallowed hard, glancing at Emily through the rearview mirror as she slept in her booster seat, her small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. So innocent. So normal. But was she? Had she ever been? The thought made Sarah's stomach twist painfully. She forced herself to breathe, gripping the wheel tighter. No matter what she had learned tonight, Emily was her daughter. No force on earth, past, present, or otherwise, was going to change that. When they got home, Sarah tucked Emily into bed with shaky hands, smoothing her hair back as she pressed a kiss to her forehead. Emily stirred slightly, her lashes fluttering, but she didn't wake. Sarah stood there for a long time, just watching her. She thought about the first time she had held her, the weight of her tiny body in her arms. The first time Emily had said "Mama." The way she used to cling to Sarah's leg whenever she felt shy. She was hers. No matter what Claire Whittaker believed. No matter what Thomas felt. She was Emily. And that had to be enough. But deep down, Sarah knew she wasn't done. There was still one more thing she had to do. Thomas was exactly where she expected him to be. Standing on the sidewalk, beneath the glow of the streetlight. Waiting. Not watching. Not haunting. Just waiting. As if he had known she would come. Sarah approached slowly, wrapping her coat tighter around herself against the cold. Thomas turned at the sound of her footsteps. The look in his eyes told her he already knew. "You spoke to Claire," he murmured. Sarah nodded, swallowing against the lump in her throat. Thomas exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "And?" Sarah hesitated. "She told me everything." Thomas flinched, as if the weight of those words physically struck him. "She lied to you," Sarah continued softly. "Lily didn't die the way you thought she did. Something happened to her. Something she didn't understand." Thomas stared at her, his jaw tight, his breath coming faster. "She is gone," Sarah added, her voice breaking slightly. "But not in the way you thought." Thomas shut his eyes, his body sagging under the weight of grief, fresh and raw, even after all these years. Sarah let him have the moment. Then, carefully, she spoke again. "She recognized you, Thomas," she whispered. "Emily." Thomas's eyes snapped open, his breath hitching. Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "She told me she's seen you before. That you feel familiar." Thomas let out a shaky breath, as if he had been holding it in for years. His hands trembled at his sides. Sarah hesitated before taking a step closer. "I don't know what this means," she admitted. "I don't know what I believe. But I know my daughter. I know who she is." Her voice steadied. "And I won't let anything take her from me." Thomas swallowed hard, nodding. "I understand." Sarah studied him, searching his face. "So what happens now?" Thomas was silent for a long time. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't belong in her life," he murmured. "I know that." He looked away, staring at the ground. "I never got to be a father to Lily. I won't steal this life from her." Sarah's chest ached. "She doesn't need another father." Thomas looked up. "She needs a friend," Sarah continued, her voice softer now. "And maybe you need one too." Thomas's lips parted slightly, as if he hadn't considered that possibility before. Sarah took a slow breath. "I can't promise I understand this," she admitted. "But I know you loved your daughter. And I know Emily likes you. Maybe it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world if you weren't just a shadow in the distance." Thomas swallowed hard, emotion flickering in his eyes. "You'd trust me with that?" Sarah hesitated, because the truth was she wasn't sure. But she looked at Thomas, really looked at him. And she saw not the man who had frightened her in the beginning, not the lost soul standing outside her window. She saw a father, one who had been grieving for so long, he had forgotten what hope felt like. So she nodded. "I think Emily already does." Weeks passed, and something changed. Thomas stopped standing outside at night. Instead, he knocked on the door. Instead of watching from afar, he sat at the kitchen table with Sarah and Emily, drinking coffee and telling quiet stories of a little girl named Lily, who had once loved drawing pictures and collecting marbles. He never asked Emily if she remembered. He never pushed. He simply existed in her world. And in return, Emily laughed. She told him about her favorite books, about the castle she wanted to build out of cardboard boxes. She smiled when she saw him, not with recognition, but with warmth. And that was enough. Sarah still didn't know what to believe. Maybe Emily was just a child. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe Lily had been given a second chance, or maybe it was just a cruel twist of fate that had led them here. But in the end, it didn't matter. Because Emily was Emily. And that was all Sarah needed her to be. As for Thomas, he was no longer just a man in the shadows. He was family. And for the first time in years, he was finally home.